Tonight, the head of the army says Britain should train a citizen army to get ready to fight a war. General Sir Patrick Sanders says it's needed to deter a Russian invasion. Is he trying to pressure the government into investing more in defence, or do we, as a country, need to wake up to the threats we face? So would Labour spend more on defence if they were in power? I'll be joined live by Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry. And I'll speak to Lord Alan West, former First Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff. He says we're living in the most dangerous and unpredictable world that he's known for more than half a century. Well, last night we told you council bosses were warning of a national crisis because their finances were so bad. Today the government announces a new £600 million package. But will it be enough? And after Conservative MP Sir Simon Clarke calls for Rishi Sunak to be replaced, Keir Starmer says the Prime Minister is being bullied by his own party. And as Conservative MPs distance themselves from Sir Simon after his attack on the PM last night, we'll look back at some less successful political coups over recent years. All that and more with Jacqui Smith and Ed Vaizey, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Wednesday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Conscription. It makes me think about the First and Second World Wars or distant countries far away. But today, the head of the army has warned that here in the UK, we're now in a pre-war, not a post-war period. And if we do find ourselves at war with Russia, then we're going to need to mobilise a civilian population, frankly, because our current army is too small to keep us safe. Well, the government's been very quick, as you'd expect, to distance itself from his comments. They talk of conscription as ridiculous. We're investing £50 billion in defence over the current year. And look, I'm always a little bit sceptical too of military bosses saying we should invest more in the military. The army wants more money for the army. No surprise there. But I did an interview today that made me pause. It's with Admiral Lord West, the former head of the Navy, and we'll hear it later on the show. And he said the world is a more dangerous place than at any time in the last half a century, and that we've been lulled into a false sense of security, that there aren't any threats to us personally here in the UK, even if there are wars going on elsewhere in the world. And that did actually make me think, maybe that applies to me. Russia, China, Iran, the war in the Middle East, plus elections in the US as well as here in the UK. The world does feel pretty volatile right now. And it was only at the weekend that the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps was warning the UK needs to be prepared for war. So on the show tonight, we are going to be talking defence. Before we bring you tonight's first report, let's just take you through some of the figures that we're talking about this evening. Now, the most recent data from the Ministry of Defence shows that the number of British Army personnel stood at just under 76,000 in October. That's 4% fewer than a year earlier. And that figure compares with 113,000 20 years ago. That's back in 2004. Under current government proposals, the army is set to be cut to 73,000 troops by next year, down from a commitment of 82,000. Well, our national correspondent Tom Parmenter reports.
For generations of British recruits, Catterick in North Yorkshire is where they started out. It's the biggest British Army garrison in the world, but the Army's fighting force has shrunk in size. And now General Sir Patrick Sanders, the outgoing Chief of the General Staff, has warned it really needs bolstering. He said, "We will not be immune, and as the pre-war generation, we must similarly prepare. And that is a whole-of-nation undertaking. Ukraine brutally illustrates that regular armies start wars, citizen armies win them." The Prime Minister's spokesperson responded, saying the UK is investing in its military and that conscription is not on the cards.
But there are reasons why such a senior figure within the military would be saying this, and one of them is to reach the British public and remind them about the state of readiness in this country should the worst happen.
In neighbouring Richmond, the citizens' army isn't yet on the move.
I think we've got to be ready. The way the world situation is, it's different, isn't it? Last couple of years is different. We're not prepared.
we're a smaller nation, smaller population, and we're just struggling to fund something that would set us on the world stage like America or like Russia or perhaps the Middle Eastern countries collaborating. And I just don't think we're in the same sphere financially.
You know, if you ask the people over 60, they would be up for it. Citizen Army, they would love that idea. The younger generation, I don't think, would be up for it.
But Jade, aged 25, disagrees.
Do you think your generation would kind of be ready to step up like that?
I think so, yeah. I think so. Although everybody would be scared, I think so. I think there's a lot of people that want to help now.
The Defence Secretary insisted that recruiting and retaining members of all of the armed forces is a top priority.
Can you give a commitment now? He'll come to the House before Easter to make a statement about what we're doing about retention of critical armed forces personnel.
I am working very hard to make sure that, in common with actually many Western militaries, armed forces, that we do have the men and women that we need for our armed forces, skilled up to the right levels and capable of taking on this challenge.
The UK is already involved in supporting multiple war efforts in Ukraine and elsewhere. And while the future of warfare may be unpredictable, the armed forces need people. Finding them is part of the mission. Tom Parmenter, Sky News, North Yorkshire.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by our first guest tonight, the Shadow Attorney General and former Shadow Defence Secretary, Emily Thornberry. Now, I know you're here to talk about knife crime, and I'm keen to talk about that very important issue.
OK.
But just to start on defence, you know, the head of the army today saying that we might need to mobilise a civilian population to fight against Russia. I feel like the kind of conscription argument is perhaps a bit of a distraction. I mean, what he's effectively saying is our army is too small to keep us safe. You know, is he right?
Well, we do have the smallest army that we've had since the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And I think that we do need again to look at what the threat is and what our needs are, and make sure that we're spending the money in the right way. And I think that at the moment, you know, we've seen so many scandals with so much money being wasted, billions and billions of pounds being wasted, where there have been the wrong things bought, they haven't worked properly, they've needed to be redone, or they don't work with the rest of our, you know, with the rest of NATO. I mean, I think it's about £15 billion in the last few years. So we need to kind of look again at that. But we also, I think, need to, and what Labour has said that we would do if we were given the honour of governing the country, is we would begin with a review, but we would make sure that we had a proper armed forces covenant so that people knew what their rights were. We would make sure that we had someone who was their advocate and made sure that, you know, the families were looked after. I mean, if you look at the money which is spent on homes, on the heating system, you know, the way in which we treat our armed forces. I mean, I don't often, you know, agree with that last MP you just saw on the screen. But I mean, he's right to be asking questions about why is it that we can't retain people. And one of the reasons is because of the way we treat the families.
Just to come in, because I hear you when you say that Labour wants a review. But I just wonder if it's a bit of a cop-out. You know, it effectively means, doesn't it, that people could be going into the next election, working out who to vote for, and not knowing if Labour would spend more or less on defence.
Well, I think the first thing that we would do, absolutely, is we would bring in... We're going to introduce a body that will be looking at...
Would you spend more on defence?
Well, hang on, at value for money. And I think that, you know, one of the problems, one of the reasons I was talking about the billions of pounds that we've wasted is that we would have to have this body whose responsibility is to make sure that we get value for money, to double-check, to make sure that when things are commissioned, we're not losing billions.
If you are...
Well,
thinking about spending more on defence,
which
is what these guys are saying. You know, Admiral Lord West, former head of the Labour, we'll hear from him in a moment, saying Labour needs to be more forceful on defence spending. I hope Labour grasp this nettle and realise this has got to be done. Will you spend more on defence?
I think we need to... I can say here, now, that we will be getting more value for money from the money that is spent. And given that we've wasted, or this government have wasted £15 billion in the last few years, we will not be doing that. And that, I suppose, is a way of ensuring that we will be spending more money. But we won't know what the state of the public services is until and unless we are elected. And then we will see. Then we will see what the state of money, of public finances are. We will then be able to make further decisions.
We've got a US election coming up too.
Yes.
It feels like there is a nervousness about what a Donald Trump victory would mean for the world stage. And he, of course, looks pretty unstoppable when it comes to the Republican nomination. The presidency, we'll have to wait and see. Are you worried about what that could mean for global security?
I think that it's a long way between now and the election in November, so who knows what will happen. I don't think that my giving a recommendation to the American public is necessarily going to be helpful one way or the other. And we will have to work with whoever it is that is elected, because in the end, our closest allies are America and our friends are there. So whoever runs the country, they are our friends. We need to work with them.
You say that now. In 2019, you called Donald Trump a sexual predator and a racist.
Yeah.
You said he should be treated like a bully and stood up to. Do you still think that?
Yeah.
So you still think that he's a sexual predator and a racist?
I mean, the evidence is there. So, but, I also think, as I've always thought, that you stand up to people and you're clear about your values and you're clear about what you stand for and you say as a friend, I'm sorry, I don't agree with you, this is wrong, this is what should be done. And that's what you do.
It's not that diplomatic, is it?
Well,
you're going to have to work with him.
There we are. I mean, listen, you won't find a politician, I don't think, in Britain who hasn't expressed similar views about Donald Trump. We're pretty clear in Britain about our views on him, and we will. But if he gets to be elected president, we're just going to have to work with him. I mean, but in the end, I think I've always been a bit more Angela Merkel than I have been Theresa May when it comes to an attitude towards him. Yes.
That's interesting. How about Keir Starmer? Which camp would you put him in?
I think Keir is pretty clear about his values and will be pretty straightforward, I suspect.
OK. Now you're here to talk about knife crime.
Yes.
What's the story? What are you planning on doing?
So, since 2015, knife crime has gone up by 70%. And the Conservatives have essentially issued 16 press releases, and you can still, tonight, buy a zombie knife online. And we're saying that it really isn't good enough. We must do something about this. We have to get much tougher. And we have to get much tougher, I think, with the executives, the online executives. And what we're saying is we will not allow these things to be advertised online. And if they are, if platforms are used, then the online executives will be subjected to criminal sanctions.
What is a zombie knife, just so we're clear what we're talking about here?
They are these most disgusting things that are essentially... I mean, they're not like the sort of thing you use for cutting carrots, right?
No, right.
I mean, they are themselves. Well, I think we've got pictures of them coming up.
There we go.
Yes,
we can see them.
I mean, they're just, there is one purpose for them and one purpose only, to show off, but also they are so, just terrifying. And in the area that I represent, we have lost too many people through knives. I've sat with too many mothers who've lost their sons, and it's heartbreaking. And of course, they never get over it. And when, the eyes of the public turn away from them, they still have that loss. And I will still be with the mothers, spending time with them, trying to find a way forward for them. And I feel very, very strongly about it. I mean, I brought up children myself in the inner city, and, we need to keep people safe. So we have to do something about these sort of extraordinary, extravagant knives.
You've worried about it as a mother yourself.
Always. But I think we also have to look at how it is that we move kids away from the possibility of being brought into these gangs and thinking that actually the way to keep themselves safe is to carry a knife. And there have been times in Islington where people have been so terrified about what's been going on that, too many people have been carrying knives for self-defence, they say. And of course, the more knives that are carried, the more knives need to be carried, and you have to break that.
The mother, talk about mothers, the mother of Grace Amali Kumar, who was awful story. She was stabbed to death in Nottingham last year. Now, she's called for mandatory prison sentences if you carry a knife. Do you think she's right?
I think that what we need to do is, let's look at it the other way, right? At the moment, you couldn't have mandatory prison sentences anyway because we don't have any prison places. So the government have said that they're going to spend all this money on building new prison places, but they've still got £2.7 billion that they have earmarked for spending on building new prisons, and they haven't been building the places. So first of all, we need to make sure that we build the additional places, and then we make decisions about what's most appropriate. And I certainly think that if you are a persistent carrier of knife, if you're one of these hard cases, you should go to prison. But at the moment, The number of people who persistently carry knives that go to prison has gone down by 30%, and that's because there aren't the places. So I think you need to approach it in that way.
Can I just ask, are you talking about knives today because you know the government's probably going to act on this anyway, and so you're just allowing you to make the argument, look, they're just following us, we got here first?
The government are going to introduce fines through Ofcom, and frankly, that's just not enough. So, we are having a week where we're talking about crime, and we have a leader who has committed his whole life to fighting crime and to making sure our criminal justice system works. He absolutely feels passionately about it and wants to do something about it. And obviously, again, as an MP representing inner city as I am, he feels very strongly about this. He has lost people from his constituency too, and we want to make sure that when we say we're going to ban them, we mean it.
Can I ask you about some comments that you made recently? You said a month ago that a May election was, in your words, the worst kept secret in Westminster.
Yeah.
You still think it's going to be May?
Well, we've had the Prime Minister come out since then saying, well, there's kind of various weasel words, but essentially saying that it'll probably be the end of the year. His working assumption, very weird working assumption, because it's like him that's going to make the decision. I mean, our working assumption might be one thing, but he's the one who makes the decision. So how does he have working assumptions?
Well, there might be
who
things
knows?
that change, right?
Well, yeah, who knows? I mean, they have run out of ideas. They don't know what they're doing. They are just stumbling around, hoping that something will turn up.
So are you saying you change your mind then? You think it's going to be the
No,
back end
I'm
of the
saying
year?
that he's now seems to be hinting that it'll be the end of the year, but he still hasn't said it won't be May. So we have to work on the assumption it'll be May, and make sure that we're ready so that if he does call an election, we have everything in place. And that's what we're going to do. But if it's later in the year, then, we'll be ready for then as well.
And then just finally, we've of course seen Simon Clarke calling on the Prime Minister to go, a Conservative MP, served in the Liz Truss cabinet. Yeah. Is Rishi Sunak actually stronger as a result of this? Because I can't help noticing he's a bit of a lone voice. It's not like it suddenly led to this groundswell of other people following him and saying that it's time to go for Rishi Sunak?
I think we just see the Conservatives just fighting all the time. I think they're just in a sort of circular firing squad. And I think there's plenty of reasons, why people might want to get rid of this dreadful government. And one of them is that at least they won't have to be subjected to yet more rounds of Conservative infighting.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Emily Thornberry speaking to us there. Well, let's get a bit more on defence now, shall we? I've mentioned the interview already in the programme. Earlier I spoke to Admiral Lord West, the former Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff, who advised Labour on defence under Gordon Brown. Thank you so much for being on the programme. It's a pleasure to talk to you this evening.
Thank you.
So the head of the army says we're part of a pre-war generation. He must be prepared to fight a major conflict with a country like Russia. Do you agree with him?
I think I would put it all in a rather different context. I think one of the problems is that our population have been lulled into a false sense of security, that there aren't that many threats and dangers to them personally, even though things are going on in the world. And the reality is, those things are going on in the world, and it's the most dangerous and unpredictable world I've known in the 50, 60 years that I've been on the active list. That's how long I've been on the active list, because I'm a bit old. It is a dangerous, unpredictable world, and the British public haven't really hoisted in that can impinge on them. And that message they do need to be aware of. And it's reflected, actually, in the fact that the government have talked gently about, yes, we're spending money on defence, everything's fine. And when people like me, and indeed like the General and others, have said, watch out, we're letting our defence capability decline, and this has an impact. And it's not really been noticed that much by the British public because there are other things they're focused on.
In all honesty, when you listen to you, I kind of think I identify with some of what you're saying. You feel like the world wars were almost, a different time, like wars are something that happened, as you say, elsewhere around the world. Is it a bit naive to think like that, then?
Well, it's naive to think that these events around the world aren't going to impact on us. And we have a war in Europe, as we know, in Ukraine, and that has a potential to expand and become something greater. I mean, if NATO and Russia ended up fighting, then that would be a completely different thing. Now, I wouldn't want to frighten the horses by saying these things are going to happen. But one of the ways of ensuring these things don't happen, for example, is if countries like the UK and Europe spend money on defence, because then when Putin looks, he thinks those people are taking it seriously. At the moment, when he looks, he says, they're not taking it very seriously. There's that great maritime nation, the Royal Navy, that had, at the time of the Falklands, had some 70 frigates and destroyers, has now got 14 of them, 15 of them. You know, they're obviously not that serious about it. The aircraft carriers haven't got enough aircraft yet because they haven't bought them all yet. And with the army, look at the size of the army. Are they really taking this seriously?
So Putin's not frightened of us?
Well, I think he looks and thinks they're not taking it seriously. And this was seen at the time of the Falklands, when Galtieri was aware we withdrew HMS Endurance to save £16 million. He thought, Britain's not interested in it, and invaded the Falklands. And that finally cost us then, in the money in those days, 6 billion and 300 people killed. That's the danger when you don't have sufficient defence.
General Sir Patrick Sanders says that our army is so small that if that happened, we'd have to effectively mobilise a civilian army. I mean, it sounds a bit like conscription or something.
Well, I think from what he was saying, I think he did make it sound like that. Yeah. But I think the reason he was saying it was because he thinks the army's too small and thought this is a way of highlighting that. But if he really believes that we've got to go down the route of well, he said not conscription, didn't he?
Mobilisation.
He said just mobilisation and volunteers. Well, that's what we did initially at the beginning of the First World War. I think our country at the moment would find quite a thing to suddenly have to be turning up at recruiting camps to say, yes, I'm willing to go and fight, because when you go and fight, all sorts of unpleasant things happen to you.
Well, you might die, right?
And absolutely, and you have to be taken charge of by people. It's an unpleasant life. But if and I think he's a danger of frightening the horses here. If such a thing as a global war did start, then obviously the country has to mobilise. And it would have to mobilise more than that. It mobilises everything. I mean, all aspects of your economy, production, the money markets, dealing with other countries, actually building up of your military. All those things have to be. It is pretty.
And you think it's possible?
Incredible.
You think it's possible then?
Well, if things developed the way I don't think they will, which is that there ended up being a war between NATO and Russia, then that would be possible. The great difficulty is containing that war so it stays conventional, where you do need lots of troops and things like that, and stopping it going nuclear. That would be the worry. And that's why I wouldn't want to frighten the horses on this one very much.
The Ministry of Defence have come back to say, look, £50 billion has been invested in the military during the current year. And I guess, some people might be thinking, look, this is a load of military guys saying, we need more troops, we need more weapons, we need more money. I mean, army chiefs asking for more money, hold the front page. What would you say to that?
Well, I can understand that. And indeed, there is a tendency, I as an admiral, always want more ships. But actually, they have cut our number of ships dramatically. And if you look at the army, they have cut army numbers dramatically. And we are fairly consistent. I was looking at Hansard since I've become a peer and been in the House of Lords. And, for example, in terms of shortage of frigates, I've spoken 37 times warning, this is since 2010, warning of this shortage and saying something has to be done, start building now, doing this. And other people have spoken about this. And although Grant Shapps talks of 50 billion being spent, yes, it is. But if you relate that at the same expenditure of that year, back, say, in 2000 or back, say, in 1990, it's nowhere near the same amount. It has reduced. And he talks glibly of this 2.5% GDP. At the present, we spend 2.2%, which does include all sorts of things like civil service pensions and things like that, which it's very difficult to kill someone with a civil service pension. And he's saying we're going to go to 2.5. And then he says at his next breath, and the world's very dangerous, all sorts of things are going to happen, and we will be going to 2.5 at some stage. If the world is that dangerous, my advice would be spend it now, because that way we might stop there being a war.
It might be that by the end of the year, we have a Labour government. The Labour policy right now is to basically have a review. Do you think they need to be a bit more forceful on this issue? I
think they have got to be more forceful. And I'm afraid my concern is that, it's not an attractive thing to spend money on defence for the reason we said at the very beginning of this, where, as I said, the British population don't see this huge threat. And if there's not the huge threat, quite understandably, they'd prefer it was spent on social welfare and things like that. And I don't blame them. I'd do the same. If there was no threat, I'd be saying the same. But there is. And therefore, I'm concerned, and I hope Labour grasp this nettle and realise this has got to be done. And I think the arena that one can get a squeeze from Labour would be in things like production of ships and various vehicles, because they're jobs and they like jobs as well. But that shouldn't be the real basis you're driving things.
Thank you very much. Really interesting to talk to you today.
That's all.
Fascinating discussion there about defence, and of course that will be featuring in tomorrow's newspapers as well. We'll have an extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Well, joining us will be the Mirror's associate editor Kevin Maguire and the Telegraph's deputy comment editor Annabel Denham. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we'll hear from our guests Ed Vaizey and Jacqui Smith on whether the UK can defend itself.
I'm Adam Parsons. I'm Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels. More flares going off, a volley of rocks, cobbles have been pulled up out and are being used as missiles to hurl at these police. We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. We have now left Italy and entered France. Nobody's asked to check our identity. Made by people who dare to challenge. Nice to see you again, Mr. Barnier. Why? Meeting you. Fishing does have the potential to stymie an enormous economic deal. What strikes you when you come to this glacier is not just the way in which the environment is changing, but the speed at which those changes are happening.
It's devastating, actually.
Hello, welcome back. Well, we're still talking defence after that incredible intervention from the head of the army that we need to be ready for a potential war. Well, are we? Well, let's bring in our duo for tonight, the former Labour Home Secretary Jacqui Smith and the former Conservative Culture Minister Ed, now Lord Vaizey. Good to have you both on the programme. We're talking about defence spending, army bosses, the former head of the Navy saying, look, we need more money to keep the UK safe. But of course, it's difficult times. Ed, where's your head on this?
Well, I thought it was an odd intervention because obviously we grew up with Dad's army and the Home Guard, and it's slightly odd to be calling for a citizen army to kind of plug the gap. And I thought we had the territorial army anyway. We know we have a recruitment crisis in the armed services. Apparently some of our ships we can't now put to sea because we don't have enough people in the Navy. And we also know that defence is prone to massive procurement errors. We had this armoured car that we couldn't use because it made anyone who used it deaf. So defence consumes a lot of money. And I think the Chief of the Defence Staff or the Head of the Armed Services has to make a more compelling case. I agree with him. This is a very dangerous period. I agree with him. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, one can contemplate a land war involving British troops fighting Russian troops, potentially in Eastern Europe. But there are a lot of other things we need to discuss. How do European armies work more closely together? That has to be a solution. how do our three services work more closely together? They already do. But we have to think, I think, imaginatively about how to get ready for a threat. But I do agree with him. We need to be ready for a threat. I just wouldn't have put Dad's Army top of my list.
No, Dad's Army perhaps not the most scary vision of all. It did strike a chord with me, though, that whole thing about we'd be kind of lulled into this false sense of security, because I kind of feel like that myself, I suppose, that you just can't imagine
which was the point that Alan West was making. Alan used to be in my ministerial team, so
really,
yeah, I know him to be both clever and good fun. But, of course, he was pretty serious today about the incredibly insecure place that we find ourselves in the world today. And I think he was also right that essentially what the head of the army was doing was just, in a way that has got everybody talking, identifying the challenges that the armed forces have now, anyway, regardless of the fact that certainly the ambitions of Putin and Russia definitely make the world a more dangerous place. And when you add in other insecurities around the world, you can understand why people feel that we need to evaluate our defence spending.
Lord West was also pretty serious about Labour. He was saying, look, Labour needs to commit more money to the army. And then you hear Emily Thornberry, she's talking about a review, she's talking about spending money more sensibly. It doesn't sound to me like you're about to commit more money to the army.
Well, it's not me, Sophie, but...
Sure. Sorry, apologies. Labour.
Tonight, Jacqui, you are the Labour.
What Emily was doing, quite rightly, was what she needs to do in order to get a Labour government in the first place. You know, Labour spokespeople are not going to come on a programme, promise large amounts of money so that the next time that they come on, you and or some Conservative representative can say, yeah, but how are you going to pay for it, etc. But, you know, let's look at the record. When Labour left government in 2010, we were spending 2.5% of our GDP on our defence, on our armed forces. We're now spending considerably less than that. We have seen a real, even the last Defence Secretary said, we've seen a hollowing out of our defence capacity. So I think, you know, it would be, particularly with the current leadership of the Labour Party, speaking very forcefully about the requirement to secure and defend the country in a way that perhaps the most recent leadership wouldn't have done. I think what Labour is trying to do is to send the messages to the country that they take defence seriously, but not spending money they can't yet identify where it will come from.
I want to squeeze in a quick chance to react to her comments saying that she stands by what she said in 2019, that Donald Trump is a sexual predator and a racist. Ed, do you think that is diplomatically OK? Is she speaking her mind?
It might be a problem in a year's time if Emily Thornberry is member of a Labour government and Prime Minister Keir Starmer is going to Washington to meet President Trump. But I admire her for sticking by her words. There'll be lots of politicians who don't. It also helps me to segue back to my first answer, which is a much more interesting speech, which he couldn't give, is how are we going to secure NATO and Europe's defence under a Trump presidency? Because that's the real challenge, not constantly asking for more money.
Yeah, it's a very, very good thought. Thank you both very much, Ed and Jacqui, on the show today. Now, councils all over the country are running out of money. Yesterday, we led this programme with a Sky News special report into the crisis. And today, the government announced a £600 million bailout for English councils, including £500 million for upper tier, that's bigger councils, to fund social care. Will it be enough? Levelling Up Housing and Community Secretary Michael Gove said the money should go to the vulnerable, well, not what he described as politically correct projects.
Instead of politically correct projects, instead of pursuing the obsessions of Liberal Democrat or Labour ideologues, we want services to be improved. What should money be spent on? Diversity, equality and inclusion czars, or disabled children who need support in school? It seems to me that the answer is obvious. And the answer for every local authority is, yes, more cash was needed to support children on the front line. We have provided that money, thanks to proper Conservative management of the public finances. Please ensure that this money goes on the vulnerable instead of on your own obsessions.
Well, Sky's political correspondent Gurpreet Narwan is here. Good to see you, Gurpreet. We spoke to two council leaders on the programme yesterday. They were pretty clear that they are in difficult financial times, that they just cannot make the sums add up. Pressure's been building, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it's pretty unusual for a government to change a settlement like this, but it was the result of intense lobbying from politicians, including 40 Tory MPs who wrote to Rishi Sunak 2 days ago demanding that he increase funding for local councils to prevent them from making deep cuts to services during an election year. It includes 7 cabinet ministers, likes of Priti Patel and Damien Green, wrote in. They've been out and about in their constituencies and they're really sensitive to the deep frustration they're seeing over ever-rising council tax bills, but cuts to, bin collections and park maintenance and leisure centres. And it's not just that. It gets even worse because now the situation is so dire that councils are struggling to provide frontline services such as social care.
It's interesting, you mentioned there Damien Green and Priti Patel. I mean, these are not natural Conservative bedfellows, shall we say. And if you kind of unite both those two people on this issue, you've got a bit of a problem. Is the money going to be enough?
So Michael Gove has promised an extra 500 million, 600 million in some cases. He's earmarked that for social care budgets, which we know is the biggest strain on most local authority budgets at the moment. He said that amounts to an extra 4.5 billion next year, or 7.5% in cash terms. But of course, that assumes that councils are increasing council tax by the maximum 5%. So it's not as big as it looks. And of course, inflation averaged at about 7.5% last year. So this might not go as far as we think it does. The Local Government Association says that we actually need about 3 times that amount. 1.6 billion is the figure that they've come up with to plug the shortfall. So it could well be possible that there are more cuts on the horizon.
Interesting. And as you say, pretty unusual to see this kind of settlement just come out of nowhere as well. Gurpreet, thank you very much indeed. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up. Well, the senior backbencher, Sir Simon Clarke, has written to the 1922 committee and called for Rishi Sunak's resignation. The letter was pretty strong, but will a one-man rebellion really bring the Prime Minister down? That is next. Hello, welcome back. Well, the senior Conservative backbencher Simon Clarke has followed in Andrew Jenkyns' footsteps and called for Rishi Sunak to go. Writing in The Telegraph, he said the Prime Minister was leading the Conservatives into an election where we will be massacred, adding he does not get what Britain needs and he's not listening to what the British people want. Well, when the story broke last night, it caused some consternation in Westminster, but there hasn't exactly been a snowball effect, and discussions of a wider rebellion have melted away a bit today, shall we say. Sky's deputy political editor, Sam Coates, is here. It wasn't exactly a big coup, was it? It feels like it's kind of a lone wolf intervention.
Yeah, when we first got wind that something was coming last night, you felt the kind of pillars shaking, because there are certain kind of inalienable truths about Rishi Sunak's political situation. It's weak and getting weaker. We know that there are dozens and dozens of people prepared to defy him. We saw that last week in the Commons, and we know that he's got difficult few weeks to look forward to. And at this point, it looks as if the Tory party has decided that it's not going to do anything in a coordinated fashion. You had Bob Seeley saying to Sky earlier that it would be bonkers, it would be silly to do anything. And Simon Clarke's been out and about this evening defending himself, admitting it was hard. He said he always knew it was going to be hard. He was rather like it was shouting at the iceberg. But he said he's sort of saying, watch this space, because I think that there is a sense that the fundamentals are so tricky for the Conservatives. They are so far behind in the polls that it's not clear that the Prime Minister's completely in safe water, and all of this stops him getting kind of his message across. And we saw that in Prime Minister's questions today. But at the moment, the calculation of Tory MPs seem to be, with all the leadership shenanigans that have gone in this Parliament, 3 Prime Ministers in one Parliament, that just at this point, you know, that they've been through this too many times before.
Is it time for you to go, Prime Minister?
The 4th Prime Minister facing calls to quit from colleagues. Heading to the Commons after a one-time ally called for him to be overthrown. On Tuesday night, the man on the right, Sir Simon Clarke, wrote in The Telegraph that the Prime Minister had gone from asset to anchor and needed to be replaced. A gift for the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, I love this quaint tradition where the more they slag him off behind his back, the louder they cheer in here. So was he surprised to see one of his own MPs say that he doesn't get what Britain needs and he's not listening to what people want?
Prime Minister. Long-time celebrity backer Steve Coogan recently said he licks his finger, sticks it in the air and just sees which way the wind is blowing. Even Labour Party know, Mr Speaker, he's not a leader, he is a human weather vane.
But events in the coming weeks will make it hard for Sunak to sustain the attack, with potential Tory losses at a double by-election on the 15th of February, a mega tax-cutting budget promised on March the 6th, more revolts when the Rwanda bill is back in the Commons mid-March, and local and mayoral elections on the 2nd of May. This man, a Tory MP for 23 years. He's seen a Tory rout in 1997, now in the Lords, able to give an honest assessment.
Let's not beat around the bush. The situation is not good for the Conservative Party, and indeed I'm not putting a lot of money on a Conservative victory in the next general election.
There is a chance, with by-elections in a couple of weeks, with local elections in May, things could get worse from here, couldn't they?
I think they... Well, I think I'd put it different. I think they won't get any better necessarily.
So lots of potential for trouble ahead, at a time where the vacuum in the government agenda is unnerving MPs. Meanwhile, what's terrifying Conservative headquarters is an apparent Tory donor commissioning polling designed to unseat Rishi Sunak. It's being coordinated to coincide with the rebellions over the last couple of weeks, and Downing Street hasn't got to the bottom of this apparent plot.
But what impact did having an anonymous donor make to the poll?
Now, it doesn't matter at all that this party came from the Conservative Britain Alliance. This MRP poll would have said exactly the same thing if it had been commissioned by Rishi Sunak, if it had been commissioned by the Labour Party or anybody else.
All Prime Minister's fates rest in here. Only 2 Tory MPs have gone public with calls on Rishi Sunak to quit, but 60 last week were prepared to defy him in a key vote. If the forthcoming elections go badly, will they join the challenge? Sam Coates, Sky News, Westminster.
Let's bring in Jacqui Smith and Ed Vaizey, shall we? Ed, do you think we're going to look back at this moment, the Simon Clarke intervention, and think that was the beginning of the end?
Well, if they don't listen to Simon Clarke, this man of vision, who has worked out 8 months before a leadership election, before a general election, the Tory party should form yet another circular firing squad. It doesn't even have a candidate who's going to succeed. I did a phone-in show earlier today, and somebody said, Rishi Sunak's got to go. Who's going to replace him? Boris Johnson. I mean, look, these people haven't got a clue. And at the very least, who knows what the next election result will be? We can take an educated guess, but it's a cliche to say it. You've got more chance, perhaps, if you just unite, point in the same direction, and head for the polls. That might give you a chance. This does not.
Do you agree?
I sort of agree with... No, I totally agree with Ed, in fact. I mean, it's just a sign of panic, really, isn't it? And the Tory party needs to put themselves and the country out of their misery by calling a general election. That's actually the way to change the leadership of this country, not some sort of strange idea that the public would welcome yet another new Tory leader. And to be fair to the Tories, quite a few, as we heard, former cabinet ministers, David Davis, Priti Patel and others, know that it's nonsense and said that it was
Even Liz Truss has come out or made it known that she doesn't agree.
Well, she doesn't want anyone to impinge on the launch of Popular Conservatism, which is her new group that she's launching next week. It's become Monty Python-esque because there are 5 families, aren't there? Is Popular Conservatism now the 6th family?
As opposed to unpopular conservatism, which is what actually most of the rest of the government are, presumably, is what she's...
I would love someone to launch unpopular... That's what she should do. Unpopular conservatism. Principles, you may not like them, and I'm sticking to them.
She had that while she was Prime Minister. That's why she didn't last any time.
To play devil's advocate, Simon Clarke said in an interview this evening with the BBC where he says the person pointing towards the iceberg is never going to be popular. I mean, there is an iceberg coming for the Conservative Party if you believe the polls, isn't there? So from his perspective, I guess he's saying, surely, what could be worse than the current situation?
Well, it's not my joke, it's Matt Chorley's joke, but as he pointed out, the last iceberg the Tory party met was an iceberg lettuce that outlived Liz Truss, who was the Prime Minister that Simon Clarke wanted to lead the country. So he should be careful with his iceberg analogies. But he's completely wrong. There is no way on earth that a leadership election can save the Conservative Party. Just full stop.
I lived through the end of the last Labour government and things were tough in 2010, but it wasn't as bad, I don't think, from looking from the outside in at the current Conservative Party. They really are in the sort of final throes of a government. And as I said, I think the only answer is to go to the country. But Ed is, of course, right. The idea that you would change your leader and not then be seen to be sort of unable to make a decision about a leader and hopelessly split, I think that's what the British public would say. I'm not necessarily complacent about Labour victory, by the way, but I certainly don't think that the way that the Tories would stand a chance of winning is by the sort of internal battling that you're seeing at the moment.
That's a good counterfactual. Take any Labour MP into a room in private and say, would you like the Tories to have a leadership election or not? What do you think their answer is going to be?
Do you think there's an argument that Rishi Sunak's in a stronger position because of this? Because, look, it is, at the minute, just Simon Clarke and just Andrew Jenkins. I mean, it's not exactly, a rebellion of the masses, is it?
I'm not sure he is, really, Sophie. I mean, I saw a headline earlier on that said, Number 10 says most Conservative MPs support Rishi Sunak. I mean, it's got very, very strong football manager vibes about it, Yes, we're giving our full confidence to our manager just before we fire him.
Yes.
It's sort of the least you can have, isn't it, that most of your MPs think you should be the leader of the
Actually, I think it's a really interesting question because you made me think of Anthony Mayer, who stood famously against Margaret Thatcher, who was, about as credible as Simon Clarke. But the point was that it showed, as it were, the foundations were beginning to crumble of her premiership. So there is actually a serious point behind the Simon Clarke challenge, if you like, that does Rishi Sunak command the confidence of his Conservative MPs? I wish he did. I think he's a good Prime Minister. There are things I disagree with about him. I think he's certainly the best we've got. But if it is the case that Simon Clarke is, to a certain extent, the canary in the mine, and people are simply not moving against the Prime Minister because there's a general election coming up and they've just got some common sense left in them, it's not a happy place to be. So I would not say that a Simon Clarke challenge, however ludicrous, makes the Prime Minister stronger.
Interesting.
And as you said, who would want to take over at this moment in time anyway, when it looks as if the Tories are going to lose? People are planning their leadership campaigns. That's what they're doing.
You get to put a lot of people in the House of Lords, get a pension, get bodyguard for life.
Sounds pretty good, actually.
Do it for a week.
It's fashionable in the Tory party to spend 40 days as Prime Minister, isn't it?
Thanks both very much. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, if Conservative MPs want to topple a leader, they write a letter to this lot, the 1922 committee, the men in grey suits. But it doesn't always work, and sometimes rebels can end up looking very alone. We're talking failed party coups. That's next.
A skin check is something we should all carry out on a monthly basis.
I was going to ask you about it.
Absolutely. So Sarah Ferguson obviously is a type 1 skin type, so she has very fair red head.
Because she's a redhead. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that puts her in the firing line for melanoma and all types of skin cancer. So really, if you have that skin type, you need to check your skin, not just once a month, but really get to know it. Just putting sunscreen on when you're out and about is absolutely vital. There's a lot of fear around sun protection because people don't want to cover up their skin from that lovely tan that we all think makes us look more attractive. But the fact is that if the UV index is over 2, so if it's, 3, if it's over 3 and over, we need to wear sunscreen from May to October. And that's not just on the beach. You know, sunscreen isn't just for the beach, it's for everyday use. OK, so there is a method called the ABCDE rule, and that basically talks about A for asymmetry, B for border, C for colour or change, E for evolution and D for diameter. So we need to look, basically, to boil this down, we need to look at change. So if we get anything that a mole or a lesion that is changing, bleeding, itching in any format, or if your intuition keeps going back to it and thinks, there is something about that, go and see your GP because early diagnosis is vital. It's not just moles, Kate, it's also lesions. So anything like an area of skin that looks different, a spot that doesn't heal, anything that scabs over, because it's not just melanoma, there's also other types of skin cancer. Basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell, which is the most common cancer in the world, and rates are rising. With melanoma, the recovery rates are good, but as I say, you have to get in there early. So if you're getting there early, you've got a 99% chance of getting over that. But if you're late, the odds go down the further you go down. So obviously it travels down into the lymph nodes, through to your lymph, and then into the rest of your body. And it can turn up anywhere, so we need to get in there much, much sooner. Skin cancer is very common. Melanoma is relatively rare, but it's more dangerous. But we need to protect ourselves, and that's not just, as I say, on the beach. We raise awareness for the Melanoma Fund. We raise awareness in sport and outdoor recreation. So we encourage people that play golf, tennis, cricket. If they're out there for prolonged periods, don't be afraid of sun protection. Slap it on because you're protecting your skin.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Right, apologies, sorry. What I want to talk about before we go on to talk about the rebellion that we've seen in the Conservative Party is a really important thing that Jacqui Smith is doing today, and it's all about Jo Cox and the Civility Commission, which is in the name of the late Jo Cox, the MP, of course, who was killed so awfully some years ago. Jacqui, just talk us through what this is all about.
Well, one of the other things that Jo cared really a lot about in her life was getting more people involved in politics. And what we realise is that the sort of abuse and intimidation that elected politicians face now, both at a national and a local level, not only prevents them from sometimes being able to express and themselves operate in the way they want to, but is actively putting people off coming into politics. And it doesn't affect people the same either. You know, it's much worse for women, much worse for people with disabilities, LGBTQ, and particularly people of colour. So what we've done in the foundation is brought together experts, asked politicians themselves, asked the organisations that have already been working on this area what they want to see done. And we've come up with 28 recommendations that we now want to put into operation. Things like better political education so people actually know what politicians can and can't do, better coordination of things that are already happening. And of course, this year is election year, and we're going to need to find ways to protect people as they stand for election. Otherwise, what we find is our democracy undermined. That's bad for all of us.
It sounds like such an important initiative. It's something I'm sure that we can all really get behind. Thanks for coming on to talking to us about it tonight. Now, before the break, we were talking about the latest Conservative rebellion that's been a bit lacklustre, shall we say. Simon Clarke hasn't started a landslide. It's left him looking a little bit Billy No Mates. So just to make Simon Clarke feel better, we thought we'd show him that he's not alone. Here are some other failed political coups. I love the EastEnders music. It feels very fitting, doesn't it? Favourite failed political coup? Anyone?
Well, I mean, I think John Redwood standing against John Major was quite an entertaining one for the Tories. I mentioned Anthony Mayer before, but it wasn't a political coup per se, but Michael Heseltine storming out of the cabinet in 1986 and Margaret Thatcher turning to her colleagues and saying, has he gone to the loo or has he resigned?
Well, you've got loads.
You've got a few, Jacqui.
I'm a Tory, of course I've got loads.
Looking at that and bearing in mind what I was saying earlier on about what it felt like in 2010, seeing Jeff Hoon again, when, of course, Jeff Hoon and Patricia Hewitt had that sort of failed attempt to get rid of Gordon Brown as we felt that we were potentially heading towards a loss in 2010. That brought back unhappy memories, I have to say.
Yeah, I can imagine for you as well. Like, you're right in the thick of it at that time. It can be a pretty lonely place, can't it? I wonder how Simon Clarke is feeling tonight, if he was hoping on a couple of his other colleagues to come.
Well, the trouble is they all love the attention, so he's probably feeling pretty chipper.
Oh, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
If lonely, as you say. Yeah.
Thanks both for a really lively discussion on the programme tonight. Always great to have you on the show on the Politics Hub. Well, that is it from us tonight, but I'll see you tomorrow at 7. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee. See you tomorrow.